We are back, and we are joined now by David Hearst, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye. His recent piece for Middle East Eye is entitled, "Israel Has Already Lost the Gaza War. It Just Doesn't Know It Yet." David, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So, I almost want to start with where your piece ends, with this sentence. Israel may win each battle, as the Americans did in Vietnam, but it will lose the war. Can we work back from there? What brings you to that hypothesis based on what we've seen of, a year and a half of genocide at this point?
Well, it's not an original thought. It's been said by quite a few people who have actually fought quite hard on Israel's behalf, not least its former Mossad chief. It is the feeling that they win every battle because technologically they're just so far superior to the Palestinians and what the Palestinians can reply. But that there are two things that Israel is not under Israel's control. It can't crush the Palestinian spirit, or as the Palestinians would say, the Palestinian resistance, which could be violent or non-violent. And the more it tries to basically kill, the more it's actually hitting a civilian population and just generating another generation of fighters in 10, 20 years' time, which is exactly who is fighting this war right now. If you think of the generation that's fighting this war, this is a post-Oslo generation that has seen no progress since Oslo in their own national aspirations, and some have sold their taxes for guns, and I've interviewed them. The other thing that has changed in this war is international opinion, and that's where the parallel with Vietnam comes in. In fact, if you go back, LBJ was told by the CIA in 1967 that there was a stalemate with the Viet Cong, but it took 7 more years to actually pull out. And another president under Nixon to pull out of Vietnam. Here, what we have is a quite rapidly deteriorating situation of Israel's image internationally, and I think there is a marked change of tone now. 18 months on. For me, everything that Israel has been criticized of today could have been said in October or November 2023. But the fact that it's being said now is I think, interesting.
What do you make of that then? Is it what do you make of the change in kind of liberal posture towards this? And we can expand outside of the United States here. The European Union, I know, said, I guess, 2 days ago that they're reviewing their political agreements with Israel. You see the Prime Minister in the UK with a little bit more of a chiding tone towards the Israelis. Where do you see that shift having happened?
Yeah, and there's also a joint statement of condemnation by Britain, France, and Canada. And that could lead to an early recognition of the state of Palestine by all 3 countries in the not too distant future. Now, I don't know. I just don't know what has led to this, because for someone like me that's been covering this and covering every death, not me personally, my website, every doctor killed, every hospital destroyed, every child starved to death, you can say, why now? What's actually changed? Is it statements about mass starvation coming from the UN? Is it because Israel has only today allowed 90 trucks in after, I think, 11 weeks of total blockade? Was it the clumsy attempt to cover up the killings of those Red Crescent first responders in Rafah? Is it the fear that when the International Court of Justice actually comes to a ruling on genocide, every leader that allowed Israel's campaign to continue under a spurious banner of a right to defend itself could be regarded in law as an enabler of genocide? Or is it lip gloss, another form of cover? Now, the cynic in me says it's the latter, because hours after the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy announced sanctions on Israel, an RAF plane took off from a British base of Akrotiri in Cyprus to conduct a surveillance mission over Gaza. And Lammy is not suspending arms supplies or parts of drones or parts for the F-35s. So, and only weeks before, Lamy met his counterpart, Gideon Saar, Israeli foreign minister, in what was called a private visit. And yet Saar is a key member of the cabinet that collectively stopped all food going into Gaza. So you could say this is just to cover a very shaky position. But that said, I think the cumulative effect on Israel will be real diplomatically.
You mentioned the Oslo process. Can you take us back a little bit into that history and explain to people how that more pro-Israel agreement than is traditionally written about in the West aided and abetted, I guess, the choking off of potential diplomacy in the aftermath of it, and increase the level of, I guess, impunity that Israel has experienced in the decades since.
Yeah, before just going into that thing, that there's something very, very concrete that Oslo allowed. Oslo allowed the biggest wave of settlement of the West Bank in the history of the conflict. And so you had peace, and you had this massive and sudden wave of settlers turning up in the West Bank. I forget the numbers, but if you go back over the figures, it's very clear that I think Oslo produced for Israel something like 325,000 settlers that hadn't been there before. So that's what was a gain for the concept of Greater Israel, because you've got to remember that Israel's not terribly interested in Gaza biblically or historically or ideologically or religiously. It is far more interested in the West Bank, which it continues to call Judea and Samaria. What Oslo did was provide a process that never came to anything for the Palestinians, but provided concrete gains for the Israelis. Settlers, I've already mentioned, but it also provided this paradigm, or this myth, that if only the Palestinians got themselves together, they had the right leadership, if only there was the right alignment of stars with the Israeli public, you would have a Palestinian state, which of course never ever happened. And that all of that has come, the basis of what I would call the Friends of Israel or liberal Zionism, the idea, the belief in a homeland for the Jews that could enable, that was an Israel for all its citizens, that could also enable a Palestinian state to be born in a two-state solution. That has very much crumbled in Benjamin Netanyahu's hands. And he has really set himself a life's mission of preventing, stifling a Palestinian state at birth. That is what he will go down in history for, and that is what he's proudest of. He says it openly now. And in fact, on the question of a Palestinian state, this is the one issue in a very, very divided Israel, which has Israelis say, a civil war boiling between liberals and hardliners on the judicial front. That's one point of agreement. That there are votes in the Knesset which are near 100% votes on the question of whether a Palestinian state should ever be allowed to be born. There's complete consensus on the Palestinian question between the so-called opponents of Netanyahu and Netanyahu himself. And that
think, answer is no. That answer is no, basically.
Basically the answer is no. And I think the international community have yet to catch up with the reality that a two-state solution was something that could have happened with the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, the Saudi Arabian plan, but that train has left the station.
Yes. I mean, there was, I think, some polling out of the University of Tel Aviv that shows that an overwhelming majority of Israelis support Donald Trump's ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza. So the scope of what is liberal and what is conservative thought within Israel is quite different than I think a lot of Westerners would like to imagine, or what we've been told about what political consensus is in Israel. But the part that's just so striking to me is we've been having conversations about how Biden's foreign policy was so disastrous in part because he had this very archaic commitment to the post-World War II system of alliances and not speaking to enemies, but building up NATO, building up AUKUS, and not being hawkish with China, not re-engaging in the Iran nuclear deal, which was Obama's arguably greatest foreign policy achievement during his time, during that time period. You have Trump come in, right? And he's breaking down the traditional liberal foreign policy orthodoxy, eschewing liberal interventionism, and saying, you know, this is a failed strategy, which he's right about. But then at the same time, it just feels like that is just about enriching himself, right? So I'm grateful to see this kind of change in this national security pattern and orthodoxy and this death spiral that we've all been watching. But if it's not paired with a policy of restraining Israel, then I guess, is there a benefit just purely to breaking up this orthodoxy or this way of thinking? Because it just seems like Trump is mostly only interested in corruption here.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very, very good point, and I can't really answer it in a short form. I mean, I think the Biden's foreign policy collapsed under the weight of what was going on in Gaza. And I think he had levers and he had room to conduct liberal interventionism and continue to conduct that classic set of foreign policy, which failed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Russia. When I was in Russia during in the 1990s, that was a form of liberal interventionism, completely collapsed. It produced Putin. But he still had the opportunity or the wiggle room within that failed policy of applying a lot more pressure on Netanyahu, principally by cutting off the arms and saying so. But Netanyahu knew he never would. Netanyahu's got a very, very clear reading of what's going on in Capitol Hill. And he's always had an iron grip on analysis of just how weak the Democrats are. And how he can manipulate the Republicans. And it could now be, paradoxically, that Trump, who's only interested in his pocket and where the next golf course is going, and his next visit to the Queen, and how much money he's loading up in his personal coffers, complete corruption, could actually prove more of a problem to Netanyahu than Biden could. Because he really doesn't. He only thinks in transactional terms doesn't think of good or evil. He doesn't care a damn about the Palestinians. And his plan is to create a larger ethnic cleansing, 3 times larger, in fact, of Palestinians than actually happened in 1948. And considering that all of this conflict arises from that one single event in 1948. How much more conflict are we storing up for ourselves? Even if you smash Hamas, smash Hezbollah, even if the whole place goes quiet and the whole place falls under Israeli military control and everything's quiet, you are going to store up a huge explosion in 10, 20 years down the line. So it is so imperative now that we change our thinking about Israel, that Democrats change their thinking about Israel, that progressives change their thinking about Israel. And it's so imperative, I think, that we have a clear-sighted view of actually which country we're supporting. When we say we're a friend of Israel, what sort of Israel? Are we a friend of apartheid? Are we a friend of genocide? Are we a friend of ethnic cleansing? Of course we're not. And we've got to stop thinking of Israel in these sort of idealized terms of a country that is genuinely good, but is just being overtaken, it's just been seized by the wrong sort of people. It's not that anymore. And there has to be a rethinking of the West's relationship with Israel, whatever happens to the Palestinians in Gaza, whatever happens to Hamas.
That you brought. I hadn't planned on playing this for you, but you brought me here because when we're just speaking about how the Democrats need to kind of have a reckoning with liberal Zionism and with support for Israel, there is a fork in the road, and you have even it's not just members of the squad in the House or the more progressive members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. Some senators like Chris Van Hollen, who you wouldn't have said is going to be an advocate for Palestinians, he's diverged from his own leader in the Senate, who I like to call here Mr. 17% approval rating, Chuck Schumer. This is from a little while ago, but this is how he speaks about Israel. And you've done decades of reporting in the Middle East. This is almost indistinguishable from how every Republican speaks about both the United Nations and international aid organizations. This is under a minute, but I'd love your response here, David.
So, yes, it's very emotional. And to almost all Jewish people, we all have relatives and we know about this has happened. Again, genocide is a vicious, vicious word to use.
I will say it's a word that a UN special committee has used.
Please, the UN has been anti-Israel, anti-Semitically against Israel, double standard. Moynihan was my idol. He became famous when in 1976 they tried to pass a resolution, Zionism is racism. To say that the Jewish people should not have a state when every other people should have a state is anti-Semitism, the old double standard ipso facto. And the international organizations, I have no faith in them being fair. These same international organizations, when horrible things go in Darfur or China or whether they look the other way.
That's actually the opposite of the truth. These international organizations and the United Nations are Western in their construction by definition. And the criticism of like the ICC, for example, has been that they basically will prosecute warlords or leaders in poorer countries that the United States has problems with and doesn't go after the people most aligned with the West when they commit human rights atrocities. But the ICC had no choice in the case of Benjamin Netanyahu. And in response, the United States is sanctioning the International Criminal Court. There's just your response to that, David, because it sounds like every Republican. Yeah.
This is a leading Democrat politician arguing against a rules-based world order.
Yep.
It's a Democrat arguing against the ICC. This is a Democrat arguing against the rule of law. Would he have said the same thing about Putin, which the ICC sanctioned within months of the attack on Ukraine? But this is unbelievable. Unbelievable. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by that clip. I've heard that clip before. I'm not suddenly waking up to it. But this is a really prima facie example of how that whole system of liberal Zionism is undermining itself. He said many, many claims there, which were all very, very mixed up. All about Jews' right to a homeland, all about, which is Balfour. We're not talking about the Jewish right to a homeland. We're talking about the Palestinian right to a homeland as well.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the right of Jewish self-determination. I come from a family of Jewish refugees from Vienna. Half my family went to Haifa, the other half didn't. Some were Zionist, others weren't. To link what has happened to all Jews, the suffering of all Jews, to what's happening in Israel, is exactly what Israel does. And as someone who is Jewish, I'm uniquely offended by that. I have to stop frothing at the mouth almost, because I know that's not the case. I know it's not true. I know that Israel does not stand for all Jews. And there is a big, big movement of American Jews saying, not in my name. And they are at the forefront of demonstrations against Gaza. And I think that is a positive thing. I'm afraid Chuck Schumer has put himself into the dustbin of history. He's put himself who in many ways an honourable man on many other issues, but he's put himself on Israel literally on the wrong side, and he's justifying whether you call it genocide. I'm not an international lawyer, but an awful lot of lawyers seem to think that that's a word that can only be used. But we cannot have a situation, and we cannot tolerate a situation where one politician after another, one generation of politician after another, says those sort of things, and in so doing divides. A genocide occurred in Srebrenica. A genocide is occurring in Sudan, but it cannot happen by Israeli at the hands of Israeli troops, when there's the evidence that Gaza war is, unlike Vietnam, the most filmed and documented war ever. And the evidence of that, even from the mouths of Israeli politicians, or even from the latest opposition figure, Yair Golan, accused Israel of having a hobby of killing babies. If anyone else said that, you would call that anti-Semitic or blood libel. This is an Israeli politician saying this. So I think that clip shows you very, very clearly what has to change within the Democrat Party, and to change for the side of fairness, for the side of decency, and also for the sake of Israelis, and also for the sake of Jews around the world, because that sort of performance has to stop.
Yep. You mentioned Vietnam. Gaza is 141 square miles. You wrote this in your piece. In the span of 8 years, the U.S. dropped more than 5 million tons of bombs in Vietnam, making it the most bombed place on Earth. By January of this year, Israel has dropped at least 100,000 tons of bombs on Gaza. I just want to repeat that. In the span of 8 years, the U.S. dropped 5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, a much larger swath of territory than 140 odd square miles. 100,000 tons of bombs on Gaza.
Yeah,
Go ahead, David.
I mean, in terms of historical comparison, that is as a comparison of per square mile. Per square mile, it works out at something like 18 times as many bombs. But in terms of historical bombings that have horrified the world since, there's a massive amount of work done on the bombing of Dresden and the bombing of Hamburg, whether that was a war crime or not by the RAF. And the firebombing that took place. It turns out that if you compare the amount of bombs dropped on, American bombs generally, dropped on Gaza, that is more than was dropped on Hamburg and Dresden and Coventry in the, whatever it is, 7 years of the World War II. And that was within 2 or 3 months. So there's an immense. So, we talk about Biden's weakness. What actually happened was that Biden sanctioned this enormous dropping of American bombs. This could not have been possible before. And I don't make that claim sort of loosely or lightly. There was an Israeli general, I forget now who said, an Air Force officer who said, had America not resupplied us with those 2,000-pound bombs, we would have had to stop bombing Gaza within 2 months. So there are two elements to this war. One is the total nature of it, triggered by the Hamas attack. And the other is the length of time it has been permitted to go on. I mean, Blair stopped, well, not Blair, but he was one of the leaders who stopped an early incursion into Gaza. And just after 44 days, and said, right, enough already, that's it, finished. But that hasn't happened. And so Israel has behaved, and Netanyahu has behaved in a way that is completely predictable with his alliances and with what he says. I couldn't have predicted in October 2023 is how long the West, America, Britain, France, would have tolerated this. Now they're coming to the end of it. But why has it taken so long and so many deaths to do so?
And to wrap up with you, David, you also write about how despite kind of some lip service from Mohammed bin Salman and other leaders in the neighboring countries, their they're doing these deals with Donald Trump, these financial deals with him, without really meaningfully addressing Palestinian plight. You know, there's like a political situation for these undemocratic leaders in the Middle East, which, by the way, the United States props up because it's much more streamlined if we can give military aid to these these monarchs, essentially, than, you know, actually encouraging democracy in the Middle East, which is it's just so crazy how opposite of the truth it is. But what is the complicity of these leaders in the region who have basically publicly supported Palestinians, but have privately been more than happy to kind of do deals both with Israel and the United States, because that's where the money is?
Yeah, I think there are two things. That one, they represent a new generation of autocrat. Their fathers had the Palestinian issue, you know, stamped on their brow. This generation has, you know, YouTube and you know, TikTok stamped on their brow. They're not interested, and they don't regard the Palestinian issue as remotely theirs. They're interested in making money, and they think that, and you know, they calculate that, in fact, a so-called normalization with Israel is the route to Washington's heart. And so they use this strategy. Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the president of the United Arab Emirates, introduced a young and unknown prince who was then called Mohammed bin Salman to the Trump clan, you know, before Trump's first term, basically through Israel. Bin Salman visited Netanyahu several times secretly, and courted pro-Israeli opinion in America by saying he personally didn't give a damn what happens to the Palestinians. And that was very, very much the formula of the Abraham Accords, which was to sort of pave over or cement over the Palestinian problem, and use Palestinians as sort of Gastarbeiter, you know, as foreign workers across the Arab world. I mean, the tragedy of the Palestinian conflict has always been that Arab rulers have sold them down the river. And they're doing the same thing now. They managed to turn temporarily the U.S. the policy on bombing Yemen. That has stopped, which is a good thing. And they turned and they persuaded Trump not to assassinate Ahmed Shara, who's the new leader of Syria, that Israel definitely wants to depose and divide into three. But to support him and remove sanctions, although whether the sanctions will actually be removed is a different matter. It takes a long time to do that. But not a word about Palestine. And I think it's a day of shame for the Arab leaders, because quite apart from anything else, forget humanity or forget moral principles. If you have 2 million Palestinians floating around the space, having been ejected from Palestine, they'll go anywhere, and they will disrupt the stability of any of their, you know, polite little rich states, because they will be a force of destabilization. And that is about the last thing these rulers want. I mean, the real problem, one last comment, the real problem about normalization is this is a deal, as you said, between a deeply dubious Israeli leadership or ideologically motivated right-wing Israeli leadership that wants to recreate the borders of Greater Israel, and people with almost no legitimacy, people who are rulers simply because they are the sons of other rulers. And what they fear through normalizing with Israel is a revolt of their own population, because and Mohammed bin Salman has actually admitted this. He said, I couldn't sign a normalization deal with Israel. Otherwise, I might meet the same fate as Anwar Sadat, who was shot. And it's
there
true.
you go.
And you
Right.
would mean the same, but that's true.
Right. But then that's what the conclusion of what you're saying is that if Israel is only accepting an ethnic cleansing plan for the Palestinians, and these Arab rulers are doing this secretly because they're fearful of the backlash with their population, but they don't want to take on millions of Palestinian refugees to absorb them into their countries, that it feels like a handshake agreement for genocide then.
Yes, it is. It is. And the only thing stopping genocide, or the major thing stopping genocide, is the determination of Palestinians. And I've met them who say, I will rather die on my land than leave. And if you go around the West Bank, where they're being ejected from their farms on hillsides in South Hebron, and they're not Hamas, they haven't got a gun there, and they're facing armed settlers, that's what they say. That's what they do. They die on their land rather than leave. And I think Gaza will do the same thing. I'm surprised that Gaza has held out for as long as it has. I'm surprised there aren't more anti-Hamas demonstrations taking place. I'm really surprised that this has gone on, because this is like being starved into submission. But we're under a big illusion if we think we've got rid of resistance groups by doing this. I think you've just handed the torch to an even more violent generation. The Fatah will not benefit, or the Palestinian Authority will not benefit if Hamas is crushed. Quite the reverse.
Well, David, I really appreciate your time today.
Sorry for being so gloomy. I mean,
but overall, it is so much suffering. But in terms of the overarching theme of your piece, like they're winning these battles. They will win every battle. Like Palestine doesn't have an air force. Doesn't have an airport. A lack of symmetry here. They control the borders of the area that they're bombing. Like, there's no way for this to be an equivalent military conflict. And yet, overall, because of the barbarity, I think you're right in the overarching view of Israel's loss here. David, thanks so much for your time today. Middle East Eye does wonderful work. Everybody should check it out. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emma.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.